Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the good old US of A. My name is Laurel Burton, and I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar from OTAVA. It's part of our thought leadership series that we like to call Java with OTAVA. So if you don't already have a cup of coffee in front of you or tea, grab it now and let's sit down and have a great conversation about ransomware today. I am thrilled to be joined by a wonderful set of panelists who are all experts in their own right on ransomware. Again, my name is Laurel Burton. I'm our VP of Product and Marketing here at OTAVA, but I'm going to be in the background asking the questions. And today I am joined by number one, Brandon McCoy from Veeam. Brandon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Laurel. So this is Brandon McCoy. I'm a senior system engineer. I am in Atlanta, Georgia. I've been with Veeam for a little over 3 years, and I focus exclusively on our service provider program.
Thank you. And next in our esteemed list of panelists is Jason Duchnowski from OTAVA. Jason, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning. I am a product manager at OTAVA. And my main products that I support are our data protection services and disaster recovery services. So very near and dear to ransomware and cybersecurity.
Perfect. And last but not least, Jeremy Bigler.
Good morning, everyone. Jeremy Bigler, head product management here for OTAVA, and really excited to talk to you today about trends we're seeing in the industry and how our clients and partners can protect yourselves against those attack vectors.
Well, super. Without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get into the agenda? And let me just say that at any time, if you have questions, by all means, log them into the chat screen. We will try to address them along the way. We will absolutely leave time at the end to address these. Any of them that we may run out of time on, we will absolutely answer after the fact, but we hope to get to all of them today. So feel free to use that chat button and ask away. This is meant to be a learning opportunity, and we are here to answer. So today's agenda is all about ransomware, of course. So we're going to talk about the basics first. Let's explain it. Let's talk about the risk factors, what it is, what's happening today. It is all over the headlines. So we're going to talk about some of the latest news that you're hearing too, specifically around healthcare and others. And then let's get into the mitigation strategies that are out there. Think about it from two different perspectives. We're going to talk about risk mitigation from a technical perspective. So those of you that are technology oriented, we're going to talk about those specifics and what you can do. But there's also a business side of it, and how can your corporation, your company, your organization mitigate and de-risk your situation from a business and legal perspective. And then last but not least, we would be remiss if we didn't tell you about the OTAVA portfolio and a lovely promotion we've got going on so that you can try us on for size and make sure that you are protected from ransomware yourself. So without further ado, let's get going. And we're going to start with a question. There's some amazing logos that are on this slide. Many of these are household names, as you can see. I mean, you've got the City of New Orleans, City of Baltimore, Cognizant, the Coast Guard. What do these guys all have in common? Well, unfortunately, what they all have in common is that they have all been subjected to ransomware attacks. And that's where we want to start today. The fact of the matter is that it can happen in any industry, to any organization of any size. And it can happen to all of us, and that's why we're here today. So Brandon, let me start with you and ask you to comment on some of those logos that you saw and then some of these headlines that we're seeing here, and help us kind of lay the land on what's going on with ransomware today.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, every vertical, every sector, everyone is at risk. There was a former comment from the FBI that said it's not a matter of if, but when. And, you know, in the healthcare industry specifically, we've now seen, you know, federal regulations on things like HIPAA compliance and making sure that you have some kind of strategy to prevent these kinds of attacks, because we just see them so much that, you know, they felt like they had to step in. The big one that steps out to me is the Baltimore attack. So that was something that I had done some research on and found out while making one of these, you know, ransomware kind of educational pieces. And I was very surprised. It was $18 million total that they lost due to this. The ransom payment was only $76,000, but they decided not to pay that for a variety of different reasons. And so during that time, the city of Baltimore wasn't able to take online payments, so they were missing a lot of revenue, and they had to get all new, hardware, software. They hired a team of, forensics, IT analysts that weren't able to get that data back. So, it's a lot more sometimes than just the amount of money that they're asking for. And of course, that amount of money is going to be determined by whether you're a small mom and pop shop, or a larger industry such as, government or, healthcare and things like that.
And I think what you're saying is that the risk is not just a financial one. This is a loss of reputation, of credibility, of financial and so
Absolutely.
forth. Yeah, makes sense. Well, let's get some of those statistics out of the way and make sure we understand exactly how this is impacting. And Jeremy, I'd love to call on you on this, but what's staggering to me is that we're in the trillions of dollars when you think about those data breaches, and that just that growth rate that is so rapid, 24%. Can you tell me a little bit from your perspective what you're seeing here and the methods?
Sure. So agreed, right? We've seen a significant increase, right? And I think that's not a secret to anybody out there today. Certainly in ransomware attacks, and then the pandemic has only exacerbated that. It's only made that worse because now we have a bunch of potentially unsecured remote workforce endpoints out there, people and systems that now provide additional backdoors into the organizations. So 1.2 trillion, unfortunately, we expect that to continue to grow. We expect that number to expand. One interesting thing, we'll talk about this a little bit more, I believe, in a few slides when we talk about some of the industries hit, is we've seen a transition from ransomware as well. Not only being traditional ransomware, right? The purpose being asking for money, but also malicious attack, where ransomware attacks have started to evolve to now do or try to do not ransom-based holding for or in jeopardy or encryption, but just simply malicious attacks against an organization with the attempt to bring that organization down. So that's a scary trend as we start to see how these now are evolving. We see growth rates, right? 24%. Probably think that this is not a terribly large number. But when we think about some of the quarter over quarter and year over year growth rates that we've seen, right, 230% increase, 238% specifically, identified by VMware in increased attacks since just the pandemic started. And last but not least, we see a lot of the traditional but social engineering starting to rise to the top of that chart, and that is the one area that we can't control with IT systems and tools, right? So that's going to be a continued reinforcement for organizations out there to train and continually reinforce best practices relating to security.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Jason, I'm going to ask you to weigh in here as well as Brandon, but let's talk a little bit about the impact when it comes to COVID, when it comes to our shift to remote work and what's happening in the verticals.
Yeah, actually speaking to maybe even some of the data points on the previous slide, when you look at the amount of just a cost to an organization, if you look at 2019 and the trillions of dollars, that sounds like a really big, almost overinflated number. But if you look at the number of records that are compromised times the average cost per record, which globally is about $150 per record, that math is actually much higher for US-based organizations. So the cost just for operating inside of the US is actually more expensive for ransomware attacks. Unfortunately, if you look at just kind of global averages, but when you look at kind of cost of a data breach, it's almost largely, well, it's very largely tied to the amount of time that it takes to identify when the breach happens and then mitigate it. So it's called the breach life cycle. So if you look at the life cycle, the more days that it takes me to get that breach under control, the more money it's going to cost my organization. So if I have a remote workforce, for one, I don't have that sense of, okay, let's all get together in a room, figure out what's happening. A lot of different departments have to get together. and communicate. So just the communication paths, being more dispersed and things like that, impacting that cost of a data breach. So, those types of factors just make it harder to do business in general. But then, in a situation where money's on the line, it's very important to just try and accelerate the process to mitigate the breach.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Jason, I think you put that very well. And I actually had a personal experience with a family member of mine. They're not in IT, but they called me because I am. And during these times where everybody's working from home, this person asked me, our company is saying that we can't access our sites to do our work and access files, and they're giving us these other links and they're not working, and they're sending out these emails. What do you think this is? And I told them it sounds exactly like what we're talking about today, which is ransomware. And this is a very large professional company, but it didn't sound like they had a good DR strategy in place. And it took I think about 3 days before they were able to get everything back up and running. Especially like I said, when you don't have that. That local office to go to, and everybody's remote, and sometimes it's hard to access things over VPNs, and when you do get attacked. So.
Yeah, so both of you are talking about the time to even recognize there's a problem, recognize that there's been a compromise, let alone addressing the situation to begin mitigating. I can see why that would make those costs and that time to recover just skyrocket. And that does tie into the endpoints, right? So we are remote. We do have those endpoints, and we have to think about that from a protection standpoint. So Jeremy, interested in your thoughts here, and maybe you could share a couple of these stats before we get into the next section.
Sure. And this again, we think about the new workforce, right? Distributed workforce, remote environment outside of the traditional corporate four walls, right? So when we look back retrospectively at what organizations have done to enable remote workforce, unless organizations were already prepared and scaled and ready to go, many organizations out there rushed to enable remote work. And during that rush to enable remote work to not impact bottom line or top line revenues, in many cases, some corners were cut around security and role-based access and authentication, et cetera. So this, I think, is what is giving justification or validity to the significant increase, and why social engineering has jumped to the top of the risk stack in terms of cyber attacks these days. Mm-hmm. A lot of the systems that we're talking about here are laptops or desktops right now, traditionally at home, right? And I think we all admit that maybe folks at home aren't necessarily as regimented in updates and security patches and similar. But a lot of this also circulates around trying to socially attack a remote workforce, right? 77% involve weak or stolen user credentials. How do I get credentials? Hi, my name's Bob from IT. I have a trouble ticket here. Can you help me, work with me to resolve this? And a user thinking that they're doing the right thing for the company is going to willingly go along with that. Phishing attacks, right? We've seen phishing a while, but this is now more predominant because we're outside of the company's four walls. And we don't necessarily have those same controls and same security systems in place. So endpoints and the social engineering behind those endpoints, right? What we can't cure with tools and systems and processes are again, one of the key entry points for this type of malware into our environment.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Well, then let's get down to the brass tacks. Brandon, can you talk a little bit about what ransomware actually is, the types they're going to see? We've been talking around it, so now let's address it specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of you may have already heard about what ransomware is, but maybe a quick refresh as well for those. So as we can see here, something that spreads via cryptovirology, and it took me a lot of presentations to be able to get that word right. And so basically what that means is just that a virus, and it's almost always an executable, is delivered into a system that may spread to other systems in the organization, or it may just lock up the specific system in question, encrypting the data, of course, assuming that that data is valuable enough that you're going to want that back, either because your production data is going to be lost and your company may go out of business, or that may be, you know, sensitive customer information that they decide to expose and share. And then, like you said, your reputation becomes, you know, impacted by that. And you know, the first ransomware strain was from 1989, and there's a really cool story you can look up on that. But that was a very simplistic, you know, code. And today, if we were to see something like that, a lot of people would laugh because it would be so easy to resolve. Back then, not so much. And then, you know, today we see a lot more expanse on the complication around ransomware viruses and how easy it is to distribute. And I think we'll get into that a little more on the next slide as well.
Yeah.
One point I'd add here, Laurel, is ransomware is nefarious, right? It penetrates in a you know, fairly undetectable manner, but then propagates throughout an environment, right? And this is especially critical when we consider that most of our traffic today is east-west traffic, right? Between virtual machines, between business applications and processes and tools. It's not north-south between internet and internal. So once a ransomware or malware gets inside of our network through compromised credentials or another route to entry, now it has essentially carte blanche to go across our entire back-end infrastructure with very little traditional controls in place.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, let's talk a little bit about the sources and who's most vulnerable in our organizations, and we need to pay attention to. So, Brandon, I'll ask you to continue that piece of that conversation, adding to what Jeremy just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we can see here, these are the top ways to get infected by ransomware. Trojan, that's the most popular, the most common, and probably one of the oldest methods. So, you know, you get an email attachment or a link, and you know, maybe you're curious, maybe it says you won $1 million, I don't know, but you end up clicking it, and you don't even know that, you know, your whole computer's been infected. So, you know, definitely not clicking on emails, especially, you know, when those emails, like we mentioned phishing earlier, right? If coming from a personal account with misspellings and, you know, asking for this or asking you to click here, definitely stay away from those. You know, as Jeremy mentioned, social engineering. Hi, I'm Bob from IT. I really like that. You know, a lot of times when we think of ransomware, especially me on the tech side, I think from a technology perspective only, right? Not necessarily, you know, just real world thieves and criminals, you know, trying to trick you and get your credentials. So that's something very important. Removable media. So very interesting study by Google and a couple colleges where they put a USB stick. It didn't have any, you know, nefarious, you know, items on it. It was more just to track and see who would actually plug this in. And curiosity definitely killed the cat. Almost half of the bait sticks were plugged in. So definitely don't be plugging in anything left behind. Of course, that's probably a little more prevalent when we're back in the office, you know, but you never know. Malvertising, so you're online, you're doing some searching, and all of a sudden, you know, maybe a little ad pops up and it says, hey, your Adobe Flash Player needs to be updated. And by all means, it may, but rather than clicking on some random link that just popped up, it's best to, you know, go to the Adobe website, see if there are any updates, you know, and take that extra step so that you're not just clicking things as they pop up. Social media and SMS, so kind of like the social engineering, but more from a, you know, social media perspective. I've had this happen where, you know, some of the C-level bosses that I work for have reached out via LinkedIn, or so I thought, asking me to click something, and, you know, I didn't, because I found it very strange that they would send that type of message, but it looked like it came from somebody within our organization. Luckily, you know, I didn't click that. And then, like I said, today, you know, it's not as simplistic as it once was, where there's just some guy in a basement, you know, trying to make your screen turn off. Ransomware is a service where you don't even have to be in IT, right? There's dark web advertisements where you can buy code. They tell you how to deploy it. Sometimes they'll even give you a nice list of IP addresses to try and hack. Customer service centers, the whole 9 yards. It's very amazing how far ransomware has come in such a short time.
Is it safe to say, Brandon, this is really now a business, right? The business
Absolutely.
of ransomware, right? There's real money, as we saw on the previous slides. There's real money to be made, and organizations are now organized behind this as a business venture versus just you know, a bored individual trying to cause some chaos.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think what's amazing to me is it's just one click. We are one click away from being vulnerable, right? It takes just one employee in the entire organization that just happens to click on a suspicious email or on that wrong site, and everything can be vulnerable. So it's not just IT's problem. This is everyone's problem, and making sure we have the controls in place.
Absolutely.
And I sort of just prefaced the next slide, which is really talking about what are those best practices? How do we get prepared, and what's part of the recovery? So Brandon, I'll have you start, and then Jeremy and Jason, please jump in, give some examples as you see it.
Yep, thanks. So yeah, so keeping your software up to date is the first one, and a lot of people on this call are like, "Well, duh," but when we're working in the real world, burning the candle at both ends, we forget. Even from a personal perspective, right? If my laptop says, "Hey, want to take 1 minute to do this real quick important update," and I'm like, "Well, remind me later," and then you get hit and. Performing a threat analysis with your security team. So looking for vulnerabilities. There's plenty of companies out there that hire, I guess you'd say white hat hackers to try and break through their systems, find those vulnerabilities and fix them. Apple, if anybody is an Apple user, I myself am an Apple user, all the time we're getting asked for updates and they're like, what, man, why do I have to update, every other week or two? And it's because there's patches. It's a cat and mouse game, right? Training staff on security practices. So just like we were talking about, don't open that weird email, right? And a lot of companies also have these kind of training courses where they'll send you an email, and if you click it, you may be asked to, watch some training videos. And of course, using strong passwords, different credentials. Don't have, your dog's name and your birthday as the password to, everything in the environment. Having mixed types of repositories. I love this, right? So we're going to talk about the 3-2-1 rule we do here, and we'll explain it more on the next slide. But you can't just have one backup and say, I'm good to go. You need multiple types of backups, maybe different operating systems, one for Linux, one for Windows. Me personally, I haven't seen too many bilingual ransomwares out there. But, as it says, it's not a fail-safe, right? You still have to have lots of protections in place, and we'll talk about that with that 3-2-1 rule. I don't know if anyone else has comments on that.
Yeah, the one thing I will say, and this harkens back to the concept that ransomware essentially is a propagation tool, right? Is one of the other aspects, and I don't want to get too deep into the technical weeds here, but one of the other aspects that is a good protection schema is a relatively new concept called microsegmentation, which essentially provides distributed firewalls out through organization's virtual machines. So each virtual machine, right, is firewalled, not in the traditional north-south as we would obviously expect, but also east-west. And what this allows us to do is stop, based on policies, right, stop anomalous behavior. Ransomware is an anomalous behavior policy, right? Your traditional back-end environments don't typically behave in that manner. So through policy-based security and a distributed firewall technology, you're able to better segment and isolate potentially affected or jeopardized, compromised machines before they can propagate throughout your entire environment. So that is another, maybe a deeper level discussion of the preparedness, but that is another aspect that many organizations are pursuing today. In fact, there was a recent study done by VMware and a few others that said that is one of the most effective ways to block day zero propagations.
That's a good point. And we had a little bit of a conversation on that if anyone's interested on a recent webinar around our Generation 3 cloud and best practices there. So there's even more if you wanted to relate to it. But Brandon, you mentioned 3-2-1-1-0. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I keep this a little more simple. When I started, it was called the 3-2-1 rule. There are different variations of this, but basically you have 3 copies of your data on 2 different media with one offsite, and then, maybe one offline, and that should lead to 0 errors. So sometimes there's a little misconception around what the 3 copies of your data is. That doesn't necessarily mean having 3 backups. So the first copy of your data is actually your production data, whether that's VMware, Hyper-V, physical Windows machines that you're actually, working out of. The second copy is a local disk-based backup. So maybe you've got a NAS on site or a SAN, Windows machine, whatever. Veeam can back up to any type of disk. That third copy is also the offsite copy. So, for instance, using Veeam and OTAVA with Cloud Connect to securely send backups across the internet, encrypted traffic without any kind of VPNs. You may want to go a step further and have it offline, right? So it is true that, if something is connected to the internet, there's a way someone can get to it, but there's a lot of things in place that Veeam and OTAVA can help to offer in terms of ransomware proofing. So if you get hit from one side, the OTAVA has it on their side, or if something were to happen on, one side or the other, you've got some separation between those backups. So yeah, that's the 3-2-1 rule in a nutshell.
Sounds good. And Jeremy and Jason, why don't you talk a little bit about zero trust protection, how OTAVA sees it, and how we see it in the scheme of risk mitigation?
Sure. So zero trust really, and this is an extension of a common concept, right? I think Reagan coined the term trust but verify. We want to let our employees in. We want to give them the right level of access to be productive and functional in our environment, but we have to validate and verify that they are who they say they are and that they are eligible and authorized to do the activities that they want to do or are requesting to do. So that has a number of steps here. We've isolated essentially 6, right? First is multi-factor authentication, making sure that they are in fact who they say they are and are able to authenticate. And this helps against some of those social engineering vulnerabilities. Part and parcel with that is securing access devices and or disallowing uncontrolled access devices. Policy and controls are key here to ensure that users, and this really talks about what users are able or should be able to do on our network. And that plays in very well with the next step, which is role-based access, right? As opposed to giving somebody all or nothing access, which is the traditional MO in many organizations today, is grant users only access to systems and tools that are appropriate for the role that they play within the organization. And that helps to mitigate our threat landscape a little bit. As Brandon just mentioned, right, 3-2-1 from a data protection and survivability process. Encryption plays a key role in this as well to make sure that the data is not compromised or able to be jeopardized. And last but not least is look for anomalous behavior, right? Think about policy-based microsegmentation, et cetera. Ransomware, for the most part, looks different than the traditional traffic in our networks. So if we're able to identify behavior that doesn't look and feel like we would expect it to be, that could be a good leading indicator that we have an issue that we may need to take a deeper look at.
Yeah, there's certainly tools that can take a look at some of the behaviors that like a ransomware infection might place into an infrastructure. So heavy encryption shows a lot of change rate across data sets, right? So if I see a lot of changes happening within my data sets, that's certainly one identifier. Just to highlight a couple things here on this list, I think that MFA is probably an underrated security posture that companies should have in place. It's very inexpensive. It's probably the best way that you can protect your organization from outside threats. And then also securing the endpoint device. Something as simple as having encryption enabled on my laptop. If I'm out and about, I'm at a coffee shop, I'm traveling, something happens to that laptop, then, I don't have to worry as much about records being compromised. There was an example in Oregon. It was Oregon's largest Medicaid health provider, where it was actually their transportation vendor. A person at their transportation vendor had their laptop stolen, and as a result, they had to notify 654,000 clients about the breach. So very simple measures can go a really long way when we're talking about trying to protect yourself. So sticking to the basics and then sort of building on top of that, I think is key here. You can get overwhelmed pretty quickly with all the different types of things that you can do.
Yeah, and that's a good point on some of the verticals and some of what we're hearing in the news. And maybe this is a good chance to let me ask you guys a couple questions. What are you seeing that might be vertical specific that we need to think about? Healthcare has been in the news, but also in other verticals. Certainly you saw a lot of government on that first slide. Any feedback for the folks that are online, vertical specific and what you're seeing and what to watch for?
From just a vertical standpoint, I think that healthcare has been and continues to be one of the biggest targets for data breaches, for ransomware. The rate at which the cost of a data breach is growing in healthcare, and the number of organizations and the number of records are directly impacted there. The downside from a healthcare perspective is that you actually have enforcement agencies that can enforce when data breaches happen for a healthcare organization. That's tied directly to HIPAA. So, I think that the malicious attackers understand kind of the ecosystem that healthcare organizations need to live within, and the ramifications if they get breached. So, I think the number one thing that organizations can do to reduce their cost in a breach, earlier to Brandon's point, when you talk about not if, but when you get breached, is having an incident response team and a plan in place. So, what happens if or when we get impacted by ransomware? So you actually have folks that they know what they're supposed to do. With this 3-2-1 policy, I know maybe where I should go first to try and recover my data. Then where do I go next? Where do I go finally at the end? If those other copies aren't good. So.
And I'll add on about finance, right? Finance or the financial sector itself really, is the second most targeted industry right now for phishing. And that is based on data in the first quarter of this year. We've seen a 238% spike, as I mentioned previously, since the pandemic, and almost 20% of all attacks across all sectors were financial sector driven. But really the scary part here is again, as we talked about earlier, right? 25% of financial organizations experience attacks that were designed to bring the organization down, not encrypt data, not hold data for ransom, not demand payout in exchange for not releasing customer records, but actually cause malicious damage to that organization's ability to operate. And that is a sobering concept, because it means that ransomware has now become a business strategy, potentially, as opposed to simply just a financial gain approach. Adding insult to injury, Accenture also reported the cost to address and contain cyber attacks, including ransomware, is higher for financial services than any other sector in the market today, simply based on the complexity, as well as, to JD's point earlier, the fact that the SEC and others now have significant legislative penalties for organizations that aren't complying with appropriate security levels. So all of this really, and I'll again reinforce what JD said, right? All of this points to the criticality of financial services, but any sector organization, to have a comprehensive layered approach to incident management and security, applications, data, and access.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, circling back around to this slide on zero trust protection, I'm curious to know, we talk about it, these are best practices. Do we have a feel for what percentage of organizations are actually implementing this today versus want to? And, Jason, you mentioned multi-factor authentication being critical here, but do we know what percentage of this is actually in use for the majority of organizations? Is this still talk? I have to believe that when you're talking about governance control in this realm, very few organizations have end-to-end implementation of something like the zero trust.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit higher than you might think. At least organizations that do a lot of the basics, but there are, more advanced things like having security analytics tools that drastically reduce that breach life cycle time. I was looking actually through the IBM report. It's from the Ponemon Institute, where they talk about, what, from a vertical standpoint, what types of solutions do companies have in place? What are they looking at to enhance their security posture? And it's probably, if I remember correctly, it's around half of them have, legitimate security, just sort of that basic piece in place across the board, where they have incident response plans and teams, and they have security, encryption in place and multi-factor. So they have a lot of that basic, but, taking it a lot further down to do AI tools and things like that, they still have a little ways to go.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, let's keep moving. I think we've talked a little bit about it with regard to best practices, but let's go specific into remote work. It is today's reality. Like it or not, it's going to be tomorrow's reality too, at least to a great extent. So, gentlemen, I'd be curious if you guys could talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of best practices here. Brandon, maybe I'll start with you and then ask Jeremy and Jason to chime in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first, when we talk about this remote workforce, there's a couple of things in play. When I'm going into an office, that is, that network is secured by, IT professionals, and they've got everything locked up tight. I'm inside of an Active Directory organization. So there's a lot of things that tie myself and what I do with my computer that could, make the company vulnerable. But when we're in the office, there's not as much to worry about. Now that we're working, from home, I'm logging in through, my router here, my internet service provider. I need to make sure that's secured. And then I have to, log into a VPN and do multi-factor authentication in order to access our demo labs and do demonstrations for customers.
Mm-hmm.
We've also, moved over to completely doing MFA for both logging in to clock in, as well as using any of the the Veeam labs that we have. So those are some things that I'm seeing. I think Veeam is doing a good job on helping us stay a little more secure, since we're logging in from home rather than that tight network that they may have set up.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Jeremy, anything you'd like to add on this list?
I think all of this is good, right? One of the biggest things that I'll reinforce here is device and endpoint security, right? We think about convenience, right? And I'm not sure how many folks on this webinar do this, but I know quite a few of our peers and myself included, right? We've got a whole number of devices that have potential inroads into our environment. But how secure are they, right? How secure is that, and what information lives on that device? And I think that's a key, really IT. When you think about who looks after IT management of data and information in the organization, right? How much of that is proliferating now in a remote workforce? To the point that JD mentioned earlier, right? A lost laptop now jeopardized an entire organization because of data that was contained on it, right? So how are we governing the distribution of data? And this really talks to a couple of things. It talks about role-based access, number one, right? We shouldn't give everything to everyone. Number two, it talks about what do we allow organizational users to pull out of our environment versus what can they assign or access remotely. And then third and finally, just simple things like locking your office door at home, right? It sounds simple and pretty straightforward, and probably not a whole lot of us do it, right? But if we have access devices that allow us to access critical business systems, make sure that those devices are handled in that manner. And it's a sobering thought when we think about the implication, but it's some easy steps here that we can take to minimize that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's two things that I would probably add into this picture as well. Just because we are working remotely, our ecosystem around us is all different. So we're working from home, we're in our house, everybody that we work with is working from home. So just the atmosphere that we're working in is different. So making sure that you test your business continuity plan while you're working from home, what types of things are different? How do I get access to, my continuity site, things like that are a little bit different when you aren't able to work in an office, you're not all together. The communication paths are a little bit different when you're working remotely versus in an office. So for sure, testing, that's actually one of the normal, the biggest cost mitigators when you're looking at how do I reduce, the cost if I do have a malicious attack or a data breach, is doing testing and having business continuity in place. Let's kind of marry those two pieces together and actually test our business continuity, make sure that we have offsite copies of our data. So again, just kind of really fundamental things that maybe I would normally do my testing every January, but because we're all working from home, I might need to test it now because I don't know how things are going to be different. So some of that social aspect of it.
The other point, Laurel, and this is almost a little bit of a throwback to the previous slide on zero trust, right? In a CIO survey, the top two control points for zero trust were multi-factor authentication, but also secure single sign-on. And the reason why SSO aligns well to two-factor authentication is because SSO masks the actual access passwords and credentials into business systems, right? And it gives a user sort of that abstracted front end to authenticate that individual through multi-factor, but it doesn't allow that user visibility to or direct access to those credentials. Again, another step as we talk about remote work here, that organizations can use to help mask and secure critical business systems by not extending actual authentication out to remote workers.
Yeah, those are all good points. And, those are tech oriented, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that on this slide, I also see a lot about education across the entire employee base. So we talked about, there's a technical mitigation, and I think we've hit on that. But from a business perspective, we can't afford to forget about making sure that all of our employees have been educated on these vulnerabilities and how to secure their home, that they've had some basic security trainings and they understand what to look for, exactly what we're talking about today. So I think this one, to me, shows a combination. There's technical mitigation, but we also have to think about the business as a whole. And with that in mind, Jason, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about another business strategy. So we've talked a lot about that mitigation, but I think it's important to think about it from a few factors, right? So there's also a legal side of it in terms of how to protect yourself. Can you talk a little bit about cyber liability insurance, why we have this slide here and the importance of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. This is like your company's umbrella policy. At the end of the day, it's again not that if but when scenario of when I have an incident, whether it's small or large. It's really important to have insurance to back up your business. Otherwise, that data breach could put you out of business. And this is really something that your business should have in place to prevent that catastrophic, I need to close my doors because I had an incident happen. So really at the end of the day, I should buy as much as I can legitimately afford based on, the type of business that I do. So it's really important to evaluate not just who you interact with internally. So I have sort of internal employees, however many employees that I have, but then who I do business with is very important. So if I do business with a hospital, I'm not only having to account for the fact that, hey, there are thousands of employees at the hospital system that could be impacted in the event that maybe they breach something within my organization that is tied to them, but then also all of their clients. So every single, healthcare individual, but every person that's coming into the hospital to get treatment could also be a person that could impact you financially in the event that you get breached. So again, the folks that understand how you do business and that interaction with each of your clients internally, super important to find somebody that understands that whole picture. Unfortunately, it is difficult to find somebody that does understand. And then maybe if I'm specific to it, I'm a technology company or I'm a financial systems company, somebody that understands that business, gotta find somebody that understands that. And then also kind of inner workings of the business. So do I use third-party contractors? How do I cover that? Make sure that it's very clear that all the different ways that you do business are also covered, because in the event of an incident, the insurance company is going to find those loopholes and find ways that, maybe you weren't adhering to the policy as you described it. So, I'm filling out my survey. This is how we do business. If I don't fill that out correctly, the insurance company can say, you weren't truthful, or that actually wasn't correct, and we're not going to give you any payment. So it's not just finding the right policy, but make sure that it's filled out truthfully and, is accurate to your business. Otherwise, it's going to be pointless to have the insurance. So a lot of different factors there. Really important to find a good person to get that policy. Brokers don't really know what they're talking about. It's just a normal salesperson. They don't know the ins and outs typically. So find somebody that understands cyber liability insurance and how all those coverages work.
Yeah, good points. Good points. We have a couple questions from the audience. Why don't I pause and get a couple of these addressed, and then we'll continue on, because I think these are all important factors. We were talking about healthcare and the healthcare vertical specifically a little bit ago, and one of the questions from the audience is, why healthcare? Why are the cyber criminals drawn specifically to that vertical above some of the others? Would any of you guys like to field that?
Yeah, I could take a quick stab at it, and this is kind of just, thinking out loud here, but I think one of the big things is the amount of data and how sensitive that data is. And there's something else that I was thinking of earlier, and that question just kind of brought it back, which is that, there's also risk of loss of life with these. There's actually a story about a ransomware attack that hit a hospital, and somehow it took them offline with a lot of their machines. That these machines were critical to people's life, and some people ended up dying. So while that's a horrible thing, it does just show the importance of the healthcare industry in general, and how valuable that data is. So I think it's a good place for these criminals to attack because of the fact that of how sensitive and critical those operations are.
And I'll talk about it from a financial aspect too, right? We think about healthcare, we think about finance, right? The commonality between some of these legislatively mandated industries is that there's penalties, there's financial penalties. So organizations who are facing absolute penalties from a third-party governance body, in addition to whatever impact the business they have, are more likely to pay a ransom than organizations that don't have a punitive aspect to that. So that, I think that's what's not only why healthcare is there, but also finance being number two, is there's a drive for those organizations to quickly pay to hopefully resolve. Now, I will say, again, caveat here, paying a ransom does not mean that you're going to get your data back, just so everybody is clear. That simply means that you've done what the ransomer has requested. No guarantee that you're actually going to get your data released.
Yeah, those are good points. And a reminder to anyone, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll get them addressed. Another question that came up is around password rules. Do we see any changes coming when it comes to user password rules and policies in terms of longer length, guessable strings? Are those coming to the workforce to help complement the security? Do we see any trends there?
I can take this one, Laurel. This puts back to the zero trust conversation right around both MFA and SSO being 77% of top CIO priorities for zero trust, and we have an interesting confluence here of challenges, right? Passwords today, right? There's passwords for everything, and more of those passwords are requiring complex password rules, right? Upper, lowercase, alphanumeric, time sensitivity, and non-reusability. All of those now create essentially a very complex process for our end users to constantly try to remember and recall, or try to use a tool, and which is scary in and of itself, to try to use a tool to store and manage all of those passwords. And that's really where we see a drive for passwords to become more user accessible, but abstracted. And what I mean by abstracted is, I don't want to give users access to my CRM or my ERP or my financial management, right? I want to give users a username and password with dual factor, multi-factor challenge protocols to get into those systems, but I don't actually want to give them ability to get into the systems natively. I want to abstract that through a single sign-on. And that's where we see that balance between password simplicity that doesn't make users put yellow sticky notes all over the monitors, but ensuring and substantiating better security for my organization, because now those users can't give those root passwords out in a social engineering attack or similar.
I think, yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to see passwords and policies evolve the way that Jeremy's describing. I think probably the best thing that an organization can do that we've started to see a bigger trend in is the use of layering MFA on top of, you know, your traditional password, because you're just not, I think there's always going to be an aspect of, you know, the human element that you can't control. You know, they're going to lose a piece of paper that has their password on it, or store it somewhere else in plain text, things like that. Just a human element where MFA removes some of those issues. So I think, you know, you have your password policy, but then the new policy will be, we have to have MFA on everything that we possibly can. And that'll be really good coverage for companies.
There's an add-on question out there around password expiration, 90 versus 180. What do we see there?
I don't know if there's a specific rule,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
most of the time we see resolution around a 90-day, right, quarterly basis. Now, that could be too short, it could be too long, but that type of a frequency seems to be where most organizations have sort of centered on. I think time will tell what the frequency there, but we have to balance complexity and, again, usability at our user level with security.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's keep going here. I want to transition. We've talked about the legality, the legal perspective, the business perspective, technical perspective. Now let's talk about what solutions are out there for our clients to think about. And Jason, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the backup portfolio that OTAVA offers, all powered by Veeam, which is why we have our esteemed colleague from Veeam on with us, because we're very proud of this portfolio. Can you talk a little bit about it in terms of kind of that spectrum of coverage that we're looking for here to protect our constituents?
Yeah, if we kind of think back to that 3-2-1-1-0 rule, what the OTAVA Cloud Backup portfolio is trying to do is accomplish most, if not all, of that 3-2-1 rule. So depending on if I'm talking about a premise-based environment or something that's living inside of a cloud or even in a public cloud, we have solutions that we're placing to address you know, that 3-2-1 across all those different scenarios. So kind of start out, if I go on the far right, our public cloud backup for 365. See a lot of companies that go out to 365, my SharePoint data, my email, you know, OneDrive for document sharing, Teams, all that collaboration data is becoming extremely important because that's how all my remote workers are connecting in together. How do I protect that? Well, we are taking care of that protection for you and saying, hey, give us the control of backing your data up and storing it. We're storing it securely. We have compliant environments where all that data is going to live. And then we give you the tools to connect to your backup data, and you can do the restores either back to your location, back to the public cloud. So that's our cloud backup for 365. Next one over from the right is Cloud Connect. And this is based on Veeam's Cloud Connect backup, and we are an offsite repository. So I'm maybe doing local backups with Veeam or with some other tool. I want to get my premise-based backups out to, you know, a secondary location in the event that something happens to my primary site. You know, Veeam is a great solution there, can protect physical machines, virtual machines, you know, lots of different flavors there. And we are again, that compliant, secure offsite target for all your data. You can store it as long as you want and use us as a repository for your data. Next two over are, how do I, when I'm in OTAVA's cloud, how do I protect that? How do I have, you know, a secure, compliant backup solution? There's two different flavors. I can either manage it myself with self-managed OTAVA Cloud Backup, or, you know, maybe I don't want to do that day-to-day administration. I don't want the care and feeding of having to do, you know, backups. I want to focus on more strategic things. I'm going to leverage OTAVA's resources for a managed backup solution. So lots of different options there. We give you as much or as little control and kind of, you know, in the weeds day to day as you want, and, you know, can take care of, you know, depending on where your workload lives, you know, we have a good answer for you there. All powered by Veeam, you know, industry leader in backup, and Gartner and others recognize that.
Why, thank you. And very coincidentally, but actually not coincidentally, we have a backup offer for everybody here, and has been in the market for a while. And we just want everybody to try these on for size. So we do have a free promo, so 30 days free to try this on, whether that's the Cloud Connect or the Cloud Backup flavors that you saw, both self-managed and managed. And really the Microsoft 365 backup, you know, we've done entire webinars just on this, and the fact that most people assume that that Microsoft is backing up your data, but the fact of the matter is they're not. And that is a very easy, low-hanging fruit element that everybody on this call can look at and make sure that you do have protection. And if you're looking for it, come to us. So we do have a 30-day free trial that we will be doing. We're going to be sending these slides out, and as well the reminder about this trial right after this call. So not only do we want to get this information in your hands, but of course we want you to be able to try this out for size and any of our other products. So last but not least, OTAVA itself, you may not know about us, but if you don't, you should. And so we've been talking very much about our data protection portfolio today, powered by Veeam. But the fact of the matter is we do have an entire portfolio. We are the market's secure and compliant cloud. You heard us hitting on HIPAA. You heard us talking about the finance side. There's a reason, and that's because compliance is baked into everything we do. So whether you're looking for cloud solutions, whether you're looking at security, anything in our backup portfolio today, colocation, and again, cloud, call us up. Let's have a conversation and go from there. I think we've hit all of our Q&A that's out there. So what I want to do right now is thank all of you for coming today. Again, we will be sending all of this material out to you. A great big thank you to Brandon, to Jeremy, to Jason. Great conversation, very meaningful topic. And we will be not only sending this out to you, but we'll also be posting it out on our YouTube channel and elsewhere. So on behalf of everyone at OTAVA, thank you. Thanks for your time today. We look forward to having a conversation.
Hey, Laurel, one question before we break. There was a question around where do our cloud backup servers reside?
Oh, yes, please.
And so JD, why don't we fill in the attendees here on where we have our services throughout the country and how that would work.
Yep, I was just responding to that as you said. So if you look in the chat, it should give you a nice little answer there. So there are some providers that do put you know, their services out in the public cloud and elsewhere. Our backup servers and our backup services. So when I talk about the Cloud Connect repository, where all your data lives, those are inside of OTAVA centers. So we have data center locations across the U.S. We have in the West Coast, in Las Vegas, we have in Texas, we have in Indiana and Michigan, and in Virginia. So kind of, you know, east and west and north central, south central locations, and that's where all of those backup servers would live. In the secure and compliant centers. Yep.
Great. Did I miss any other questions that went right past me? I think we're good. All right. Again, thank you on behalf of everyone at OTAVA and Brandon at Veeam. Have a great day, and appreciate you joining us.
Thanks all.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.